Hello, my name is Jacob Grinwis. I have the pleasure today of presenting my undergraduate capstone research project on LGBTQ census exclusion and data collection. Now, before we can talk about LGBTQ census exclusion, we should first talk about the US Census in general. The US Census is a survey sent out to the American public every 10 years that aims to provide an estimate on the demographic composition of America's population, economy, and housing. The census has three primary uses. First, it is used to define state legislative districts. It also is used to guide the allocation of federal funding for public programs, over $675 billion between the census and American Consumer Survey combined. Thirdly, the census is used to enforce anti-discrimination laws and regulations. Sexual orientation and gender identity is not a current identity collected in the decennial census. The census does not and has not ever included a direct question on sexual orientation or gender identity. However, the census does include a question on same-sex marital status. However, for obvious reasons, this only captures a fraction of LGBTQ people, those in same-sex marriage relationships. This research focuses on the relationship between data collection and the adverse experiences or quality of life of LGBTQ Americans. And specifically, I'm going to be trying to answer the question, does data collection reduce the adverse experiences of LGBTQ Americans? Diving into the literature review, in the 2020 article, Straightwashing the Census, Velt discusses the history of SOGI questions in the decennial census. The census began to collect LGBTQ data in 1990 through the addition of an unmarried partner familial status category. The ACS followed in 2005 with the addition of their unmarried partner status category as well. Similar to the same-sex marital status category, these two categories also fail to provide a representative depiction of the LGBTQ population as a whole. Velt continues to discuss sexual orientation and gender identity questions pertaining to the census through the lens of the myth of LGBTQ affluence. This is a stereotype of LGBTQ people being wealthy, powerful, professionally elite, and well-educated. In reality, this stereotype is not accurate. As we can see here, there are various proportions of LGBTQ identities and their experiences with poverty compared to the proportion of their counterparts experiencing poverty in the United States. As we can see, the LGBTQ identities experience higher rates of poverty than their cisgendered straight counterparts. Velt continues with a discussion of the undercount by providing a quote from Walrath. What's measured is what matters when it comes to public policy. And this could not be closer to the truth in this situation. The identity undercount caused by LGBTQ identity exclusion in the census perpetuates the harmful stereotype of LGBTQ affluence. It also creates barriers to modifying programs targeted at population level disparities for LGBTQ people. And additionally, there are dignitary, political, and economic harms associated with being left out of the decennial census. In the 2020 article, Counting an Invisible Class of Citizens, the LGBT population in the US Census, Naylor discusses the Trump administration's 2020 census and their decision to remove SOGI questions from the census plan. The Trump administration presented their plan in 2017 that originally contained SOGI questions. Within a few hours, the questions were removed, and the Trump administration publicly claimed that there was no federal data need for the addition of SOGI questions in the 2020 census. This inspired Naylor to approach this decision through a quantitative and analytical lens. From there, they asked two questions. Is there a data need to include LGBTQ citizens in the census? And are LGBT citizens being treated equally and equitably compared to heterosexual citizens? Naylor came to the conclusion that there is in fact a need for LGBTQ data collection, It is beyond certain that LGBTQ people are not treated equally to other marginalized and disadvantaged communities. All four criteria for social equity were similarly not being met for LGBTQ Americans. And in summary, Naylor concludes that the decision to omit the SOGI questions from the 2020 census was a politically motivated decision and was not based on empirical evidence. Concerning the nature of SOGI data collection today, currently there are 11 federal surveys that collect limited data on sexual orientation and gender identity. However, due to the specialized nature of these surveys, that information is heavily fragmented and only captures a glimpse of LGBTQ population numbers and demographics. Additionally, there are some independent foundations or organizations that collect LGBTQ data. The first is the Williams Institute out of the UCLA School of Law, and Gallup polls also collect their own LGBTQ demographic data. So for the purposes of this study, I'm wanting to further the discussion of the need for LGBTQ representation in federal data collection. Like I had mentioned before, I really want to explore the relationship between data collection and quality of life for LGBTQ Americans. How does simply being counted improve the quality of life of LGBTQ people? For this research, my data is drawn from two sources primarily. The first source is the Movement Advancement Project. This is an independent nonprofit think tank founded in 2006 that focuses on achieving equality and opportunity for all. It specifically focuses on collecting LGBTQ data and policy information. The data for this database, this website, draws data from the Williams Institute, as well as the US Census and Gallup polls as well. Essentially, this foundation creates a state policy map, which you can see to the right, that tracks nearly 40 LGBTQ related laws in all 50 states and territories. Each law or policy has a certain point value assigned to it. Some are negative if the law is harmful to LGBTQ identities. And if the law is present, the state receives the point or loses the point based on its sign value. Essentially, the largest score is 38.5, and the lowest scores can be in the negatives. So you can see here the states that are green colored, darker green indicates a higher score. The darker reddish colors indicate a low score. The score tells you the nature of the state's LGBTQ policy climate. The second main source of data that I draw on for this research project comes from the UCLA School of Law Williams Institute. This is an independent research organization founded in 2001 that focuses primarily on collecting LGBTQ data. Specifically, I gathered socioeconomic data for LGBTQ identities from this website. We can see here on the right in this graphic, I have collected data on LGBTQ unemployment, uninsured rates, food insecure rates, and the population proportion of LGBTQ identities that have an income of less than $24,000 a year. Additionally, I supplement these two larger data sources with data from the US Census. From the census, I draw total state population numbers, and I also draw data from the 2020 presidential election results. I use that data to sort of infer the state's political tendencies. For example, if the state voted Republican in the 2020 election, I counted that state as politically leaning Republican. If the state voted Democratic in the 2020 election, I counted that state's political tendencies as Democratic. Moving forward, taking these two data sources, as well as the supplemental data from the census and Politico.com, the 2020 presidential election, I compiled my own data set, which contained 51 states and 31 variables describing various LGBTQ factors in the states. The notable variables you can see here on the right are bolded, but I wanted to talk about the adversity index. This is the variable I use as my dependent variable. Essentially, this is used to represent the quality of life for LGBTQ people. It is the average of the socioeconomic variables taken from the Williams Institute: unemployed percent, food insecure percent, income less than 24%, uninsured percent. And those are averaged to give us a percentage of adversity index. Essentially, what percentage on average in the state of LGBTQ people deal with adversity of one of these four socioeconomic variables. Similarly, the law data collection is a binary variable that is 1 if the state collects LGBTQ data and 0 if the state does not collect LGBTQ data. The policy score is that score I was discussing with the map. It discusses how the policy climate for LGBTQ citizens tend to be in the various states. Concerning my methodology, just to remind you, my research question is that, does data collect, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. My research question is, does data collection reduce the adverse experiences of LGBTQ Americans? That adversity index is being used as the variable to describe adverse experiences. And I begin my analysis with a comparison of summary statistics. I take the summary statistics for the variables, the socioeconomic variables, and I compare them between states that collect data on LGBTQ identities and states that do not collect data on LGBTQ identities. Similarly, I take some correlations between those socioeconomic variables and the state's policy score, and I compare those correlations between states that collect data and states that do not collect data. Then I run an OLS regression analysis and follow a similar process, comparing states that do collect data to the states that do not collect data. You can see here below my base specification for my regression analysis. Again, most notable is the adversity index being the dependent variable. Here's the output of my variable summary statistics. We don't need to spend much time here. There's a lot going on. We can direct our attention to policy score on the left-hand side. Here we see that the mean policy score for the states is 15.38. And on the right, we can see the adversity index. The mean score for adversity index is 1.94, which represents 19.4% of LGBTQ identities dealing with adversity. Moving on to the summary statistics comparison, here we have two tables that compare the summary statistics of those socioeconomic variables between the states that collect LGBTQ data and the states that do not collect LGBTQ data. The main takeaways from these tables are that the states that collect data have lower mean values for the percent of LGBTQ people who are unemployed, uninsured, have an income less than 24,000, as well as the adversity index. The states that do collect data have lower mean values for all of those variables. The states that do not collect data, however, have higher values, with the exception of food insecurity, where both baskets of states have an equal value for food insecurity percentages. Moving on to the correlation matrices. Similarly, I compare the socioeconomic variables with the policy score to draw a correlation value, and then I compare the two baskets of states that collect data and the states that do not collect data. The main takeaway from here is that states that do collect LGBTQ data have stronger linear correlations between policy scores and socioeconomic variables, which can be seen on the bottom row. Moving on to the regression results, here's the full regression model output. This contains all 51 states, and the significant variables in this case are policy score and the parents percent. Looking at the policy score coefficient, this is logical because we expect a negative relationship in this case. This tells us that if the policy score, or as the policy score increases by 1 point, the adversity index decreases by 0.16%. Looking at the parents percent, this tells us that as parents percent increase, this is a positive relationship. As parent percent increase by 15%, the adversity, or I'm sorry, by 1%, the adversity index increases by 15%. So there is a positive relationship between percentage of LGBTQ parents and the adversity index. Moving on to the comparison between states that collect data and states that do not collect data in the regression analysis. If the state collects data, we can see up on the top here, the top regression output. The states that collect data, the only statistically significant variable is policy score. We see that the T statistic decreased in this case, which means it is less statistically significant, still statistically significant, but it's less strong. And the relationship is still negative, which is good, but the degree of effect is roughly larger, but it's a fairly small difference. The adjusted R squared value has also decreased in the regression output that includes states that collect data. However, this is probably just because we've lost the explanatory power from the states that do not collect data. Concerning that regression, the states that do not collect LGBTQ data, the regression output as a whole is not statistically significant, so we can't really use that to draw any inference. Moving on to the discussion of limitations, the nature of the data collected for this analysis was difficult to find, and it was difficult to ensure its accuracy or relevancy. For example, the data used in my analysis came from the years 2018 to 2020, which is atypical considering the span of time. However, it was necessary to ensure a large enough sample size. So the dearth of LGBTQ data continues to be a limitation in the field of this type of study, in this topic. Similarly, the complexities of identity and intersectionality are very difficult to survey. This can be seen in the law data collect variable. LGBTQ identities are large in number, and some states collected data on certain identities, and some states, or not other identities. For example, they collected data on gay and lesbian people, but not transgender people. So it was difficult to decide whether or not that counted as data collection. Additionally, the June 2020 Supreme Court ruling, Bostock versus Clayton County, added sexual orientation and gender identity as protected categories against employment discrimination. This ruling could influence state policy variables and therefore influence the summary statistic result, correlation result, and regression outputs. Also worth mentioning, my research experience is relatively limited. This was a learning experience for me, specifically relating to the regression output and the data use. So that perhaps too is a limitation of this research project. Policy implications. However, I do believe that within this research, there does appear to be a relationship between data collection and LGBTQ quality of life. The inclusion of a sexual orientation question, or sexual orientation and gender identity question on the next census could provide the data needed to more accurately interpret the relationship between data collection and LGBTQ quality of life. As discussed in the economic literature from the literature review, the limitations of this study follow that the absence of data stands between accurate research. And with that being said, I believe the absence of data and the limitations of the study further explain the need for accurate and relevant data on LGBTQ Americans, which could be achieved with the inclusion and addition of SOGI questions in the next census. Here are a list of my references and sources, should you wish to explore them for yourself. And I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my presentation. Thank you.